Hey students, it's me, Miss Schmidt. Um, so we have another ice snow day tomorrow, which is Wednesday, and you'll return to class on Thursday more than likely. I just don't want us to fall behind. A lot of the stuff again that we're doing this week in class, it's all lecture stuff, and so doing it via audio isn't the end of the world, and it's no different than what you would have, except now you're doing it from the comfort of your own home. If you're someone who has a poor internet connection, that's totally fine. We'll give you a thumb drive. You can have it and go over the stuff. This unit, this lecture, we're going back to that concept of sovereignty, but we're taking sovereignty and we're looking at it from our own government or the US government. As an aside note, I have multiple dogs, and if they bark during the presentation, I'm super sorry about it. But today we're going to look at the US government specifically and how power is divided in that. One thing with this lecture is that I'm going to be putting a clicker check in the hub, and you'll see it'll be a quiz-like document. It'll have more than 5 questions, which is unusual if it's a clicker check, but my goal in doing this is making sure that you're getting the concepts, that you're listening, watching the video presentation, and I intend to make it super easy. Because it's going to be so easy, we're not going to round it the 20 points that we usually do, but it should be a free 100 if you sit through the presentation and pay attention to what's going on. It's timed, so you can't start it and then watch the presentation to figure out what the questions are. It won't show you what you got wrong either. It'll just tell you that it's wrong, and I do that intentionally so that you can't share the answers. And you only have one chance at it, so make sure that you're prepared to take it before you sit down to take it. Do it when you can. If there's an issue about you doing it, no big deal right now. We'll take care of it when you get back to school. And that's pretty much it. The due dates are still the same for everything right now. The first thing I actually want to do is go back to the last lecture when I was talking about unitary and federal governments. And this is an image from last year's FRQ. So our students who are sophomores right now, this was their question on the AP exam. Actually, a lot of our students didn't do well on it. Nationally, a lot of students didn't do well on it. And it has 2 types of government that it's trying to show you. It has unitary and federal. And so the question asked about which of the countries above is a unitary government and which one is a federal government. Remember that a federal government takes some of its power or it takes some of its sovereignty and it divides it amongst different groups. And if you look at the images, Germany has a whole bunch of little sublines within the country, which means that those are its governance provinces, and so those sublines should have given it away. In contrast, Japan doesn't have those little lines, and so it's a unitary government. The question specifically asks about the pros and cons of each of the governments. And for a unitary government, your pros are going to be standardization. You have less repetition in terms of how the laws are done. You save some money and some efficiency because you don't duplicate processes. And today you're going to learn that we have multiple layers of government in the US. We're a federal government. So you can understand how sometimes there is a duplication of efforts. Whereas a unitary government has a drawback in that it may not be as receptive or able to deal with local needs, and that's a positive of a federal government, in that it has that capability to address local needs if there's marginalized groups or people who want something specific for them. This is important because when we look at our own government, we actually change the scale of how we look at it. So you need to understand that the U.S. government has layers and layers and layers. It's not just the federal government. It's not just the president. But we have a federal government, which if we go back to that concept of kind of sovereignty points, the federal government retains the most power. And the federal government has 3 branches, and we're going to go into a lot more detail about that. And then underneath the federal government, you have a state government, and this includes your state governors. It includes the state legislature. The state has a house and a senate usually. There's a few states where I think it's unicameral where they only have one. Underneath the state government, you have what are called county governments. So we live in Harris County. So you have the state of Texas. The state of Texas, its legislature makes rules and laws that apply to everyone that's in the state. But then a county A county may have rules and laws that apply to everybody who is in that county, like Harris County. Then the city is underneath the county. Sometimes you won't have a city government because there's no major cities, and so you may have some townships, and the county is the lowest form of government that you have. But Houston is a very large city. So the city government will have its mayor, it will have its city council, it will have its school board, it will have these different layers. And as you look at the diagram I made, the higher you go, the more power or more authority that branch of the government has. It also means that the branch that's above it has more authority than the one that is below it. There's a lot more city governments than there are county governments. But just because there's more of them, it doesn't mean that they have as wide an area of oversight or jurisdiction. But we're going to actually start looking at the federal level today. And as another side, I feel like there's a lot of typos in my PowerPoint. I'm really sorry about that, and Ms. Schultz isn't here to check them. So we're going to watch a video in a second, and it just tells you, hey, here's the federal government, and here is how power is divided in the federal government. And you need to know that the federal government, it has the most authority in the United States. Now, you'll have some groups that will fight back and forth about, oh, no, that's a state's right. The state should have authority over that. So they go back and forth sometimes. But we're going to say that, okay, the federal government, it has the most sovereignty. It can make the greatest level of decision making. But because the federal government is so powerful, it has something called separation of power. And this means that these three areas of the federal government, the executive, which is the president, the legislature, and the judiciary, they have checks and balances on one another, meaning that it's almost like rock, paper, scissors, that each one can do something to try and check the other one so that they can't unilaterally engage in a decision on their own. So we're going to watch a really quick video real quick.
Have you ever wondered who has the authority to make laws or punish people who break them? When we think of power in the United States, we usually think of the president, but he does not act alone. In fact, he is only one piece of the power puzzle, and for very good reason. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the United States government was in a state of change. The Founding Fathers knew that they did not want to establish another country that was ruled by a king. So the discussions were centered on having a strong and fair national government that protected individual freedoms and did not abuse its power. When the new Constitution was adopted in 1787, the structure of the infant government of the United States called for three separate branches, each with their own powers, and a system of checks and balances. This would ensure that no one branch would ever become too powerful, because the other branches would always be able to check the power of the other two. These branches work together to run the country and set guidelines for us all to live by. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Many people feel that the Founding Fathers put this branch in the document first because they thought it was the most important. The legislative branch is comprised of 100 U.S. senators and 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is better known as the U.S. Congress. Making laws is a primary function of the legislative branch, but it is also responsible for approving federal judges and justices, passing the national budget, and declaring war. Each state gets 2 senators and some number of representatives depending on how many people live in that state. The executive branch is described in Article 2 of the Constitution. The leaders of this branch of government are the president and vice president, who are responsible for enforcing the laws that Congress sets forth. The president works closely with a group of advisors known as the cabinet. These appointed helpers assist the president in making important decisions within their area of expertise, such as defense, the treasury, and homeland security. The executive branch also appoints government officials, commands the armed forces, and meets with leaders of other nations. All that combined is a lot of work for a lot of people. In fact, the executive branch employs over 4 million people to get everything done. The third branch of the U.S. government is the judicial branch and is detailed in Article 3. This branch is comprised of all the courts in the land, from the federal district courts to the U.S. Supreme Court. These courts interpret our nation's laws and punish those who break them. The highest court, the Supreme Court, settles disputes among states, hears appeals from state and federal courts, and determines if federal laws are constitutional. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and unlike any other job in our government, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, or for as long as they want to stay. Our democracy depends on an informed citizenry, so it is our duty to know how it works and what authority each branch of government has over its citizens. Besides voting, chances are that sometime in your life you will be called upon to participate in your government, whether it is to serve on a jury, testify in court, or petition your congressperson to pass or defeat an idea for a law. By knowing the branches, who runs them, and how they work together, you can be involved, informed, and intelligent.
So, a few of them may be like, why are we doing this, learning about the federal government? And it's because it's good for you to know how the government works, even if minimally so. Trust me, this is the super, super, super abridged version. So we're focused on geography or the distribution of things. So understanding federal elections, like the president, explains how those votes are distributed. Here's the thing. The president is elected by the Electoral College, and so we're going to watch some videos that explain how that is done. The presidential election isn't gerrymandered. We talk about gerrymandering, that's one of our vocabulary terms. So is Electoral College. I believe Electoral College is, but I know gerrymandering is for sure. And you need to understand how these things impact positions or how things are spatially distributed. So we're going to watch some videos on the Electoral College. And you have to understand how the Electoral College is divided so you can see how different areas are represented. Here's the deal. We don't actually elect the president. So when you turn 18 and you're able to cast your vote, you're going to the polls and you're telling an electoral representative who you want to be president. You're not the person who's actually casting the vote that matters for who gets to be selected as president. There's a problem with the Electoral College. And so we'll watch 2 videos back to back. And one explains how the Electoral College works. And the second one tells you what the problem is with the Electoral College, which means that you don't have to have the popular vote or the vote of all the people in the U.S. or majority of the people in the U.S. to be president. And this has happened a few times. So this video is older and it cites, I think, 2 other elections that it's happened where the popular vote didn't actually elect the president. In my lifetime, it's happened twice, and I'm not as old as most of you think that I am, which means that it's something that's occurring more often, especially as politics has become more structured in terms of targeting or running campaigns that seek to get the Electoral College as opposed to the popular vote. So this is what just happened in the election that we had. A majority of Americans did not vote for Trump. The majority of Americans voted for Clinton. However, because of the Electoral College and how that's delineated, Trump was elected president. So, 2 videos.
Election day, when Americans everywhere cast their ballot for the next president of the United States. Except, not really. Americans don't directly vote for president. So what's happening on election day then? It's a bit complicated because of something called the Electoral College. To keep things simple for now, think of the Electoral College as the collection of 538 votes that determine who the president of the United States will be. Why 538? Because that's the number of senators, 100, plus the number of representatives, 438 in Congress. Why are there 438 representatives in Congress? Stop asking so many questions right now, we're trying to keep this simple. These 538 votes in the Electoral College aren't given to the citizens directly, but are instead divided among the states. So how does the Electoral College give out the votes? Each state, no matter how populous or not, gets 3 votes to start. The remaining votes are given out roughly in proportion to the population of the states. The more people the state has, the more votes it gets. Here's a map of the United States showing the voting power each state has by making one hexagon equal to one Electoral College vote for president. Because Electoral College votes mostly, though not completely, scale with population, it's also a map of where people live with a bonus given to the smaller states to make them a bit bigger than they would otherwise be. In early November, when citizens go to the polls, they aren't voting for president directly, but they're really telling their state how they want it to use its electoral votes. 48 of the 50 states give all their Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins a majority in their state. Take Florida, for example, which has 29 electoral college votes. If a candidate wins a majority, no matter how small that majority, he gets all the votes. So the path to the White House is clear. Win enough majorities in enough states to get more than half of the electoral college votes, and you get to sit at the big desk. That wasn't so complicated, you say? Well, there were a few details left out. The Electoral College loves states, but what about the 11 million Americans who don't live in a state? What happens to their vote, and where are these people hiding? There are about 600,000 in the District of Columbia, an area set aside specifically not to be a state so that the capital of the country would be free of local politics. For most of the United States history, people living in the district didn't get to vote for president. Then, in 1964, the Constitution was amended to give D.C. the same number of votes as the least populous state, Wyoming. So the Electoral College likes D.C., but you know who it doesn't like? The territories. The often forgotten Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Northern Mariana Islands get no votes from the Electoral College because they aren't states and they don't have a special constitutional amendment to recognize them. Which is a bit odd considering they're part of the United States and everyone who lives there is a citizen, so for most practical purposes they're just like D.C., and 4.4 million people live in the territories. That might not sound like a lot, but it's more than the populations of Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Delaware combined. But still, no votes from the Electoral College do they get. The whole situation with territories is extra strange when you consider the final group of Americans who don't live in the states, the 6.3 million Americans who live abroad. If you're a United States citizen who moves to a foreign country, you can usually send a postal vote to the last state that you resided in. But if you move within the United States to one of its territories, you lose your right to vote for president as long as you live there, making these the only spots on the whole earth where Americans are not allowed to vote for president. Actually, they're the only spots in the whole universe because American astronauts are allowed to vote from space. The last bit of Electoral College complication is the weirdest and has to do with the votes themselves. The state of Florida and all the others don't really give votes to a candidate. That's just a simplified way to think about it, because the reality of the situation is odd. What citizens are voting for on Election Day is a group of electors appointed by the political parties who choose the president on the citizens' behalf. The number of votes that a state gets from the Electoral College is actually the number of electors the state is allowed to send to a collegiate meeting to vote on who the president will be. What makes it odd is that while these electors promise they will vote for president as their state citizens want them to, they aren't required to do so. Electors are free to vote the way they want. While this has never swung an election, 87 times in the past electors have voted against the wishes of the very people who elected them. Why set up this crazy system where a small group of people essentially unknown to the general public are the ones who really decide on the president? Because in the 1700s, when the Electoral College was designed, the quickest way to send a piece of information was to write it down on a piece of paper, hand it to a guy on a horse, wish him Godspeed, good sir, and hope he didn't get killed by Indians or die of dysentery along the way. Because information moved so slowly, and because the young country was so big, the idea was to send all the electors to Washington where they could have the most up-to-date information to make decisions for the people back home who wouldn't know the latest news. Though now, when we carry information on beams of light in fiber optic cables rather than on the backs of herd animals, this particular aspect of the Electoral College might seem a little out of date. Nonetheless, while most people think that the election for president takes place in early November, it doesn't. That's the election that determines who the electors will be. The 538 electors who are chosen then meet in early December, and they cast the real votes that determine who is the next president of the United States. In a fair democracy, everyone's vote should count equally, but the method that the United States uses to elect its president, called the Electoral College, violates this principle by making sure that some people's votes are more equal than others. The Electoral College is, essentially, the 538 votes that determine who wins the presidency. If these votes were split evenly across the population, every 574,000 people would be represented by one vote. But that's not what happens because the Electoral College doesn't give votes to people, only states, which has some unfair consequences. For example, there are 11.5 million people in Ohio, so, to fairly represent them, it should get 20 electoral votes. But the Electoral College doesn't give Ohio 20 votes, it only gets 18, 2 less than it should. Where those other votes go? To states like Rhode Island. Plucky Rhode Island has 1.1 million people in it, so it should have about 2 votes, but instead it gets 4. Those extra 2 votes that should be representing Ohioans go to representing Rhode Islanders instead. Why? Because, according to the rules of the Electoral College, every state, no matter how few people live there, gets 3 votes to start with before the rest are distributed according to population. Because of this rule, there are a lot of states with a few people that should only have 1 or 2 votes for president but instead get 3 or 4. So Georgians, Virginians, Michiganders, and Jerseyites are each missing 1 vote. Pennsylvanians, North Carolinians, Ohioans, and Hoosiers are missing 2, Floridians are missing 4, New Yorkers 5, Texans 6, and Californians are 10 votes short of what they should get. Because of this vote redistribution, the Electoral College essentially pretends that fewer people live where they do and more people live where they don't. An American who lives in one of these states has their vote for president count for less than an American who lives in one of these states. In some cases, the Electoral College bends the results just a little, but if you live in a particularly large or small state, it bends them a lot. One Vermonter's vote, according to the Electoral College, is worth 3 Texans' votes, and one Wyomingite's vote is worth 4 Californians'. Now whoa, hold on there, son, you might be saying to yourself right now. You're missing the whole point of the Electoral College. It's to protect the small states from the big states. Give the small states more voting power and the presidential candidates will have to pay them more attention in an election. If that's the goal of the Electoral College, it's failing spectacularly. Here's a graph showing the number of visits the presidential candidates paid to each of the states in the last 2 months of the previous election. If it looks like there are a few states missing, you're right. Only 18 of the 50 states received even a single visit from a candidate, and just 2 of those states, Maine and New Hampshire, have very small populations. The area of the country with the most small states is conspicuously missing. The Electoral College doesn't make candidates care about small states. But interestingly, the biggest states, California, Texas, and New York, are missing as well. So what's going on? Looking closer, just 4 states, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, received a majority of the candidates' attention during the election. And if you follow the money, it's the same story. Why do candidates spend so much money and time in so few states? Because the way the Electoral College works forces them to do so. The elections are winner take all. As long as a candidate gets just over 50% of the popular vote in a state, he wins 100% of that state's electoral votes. That means winning by millions of citizens' votes is no better than winning by a single vote, so candidates are safe to ignore states where they poll with big margins. Instead, the Electoral College makes candidates intensely interested in the needs of just a few states with close races to the detriment of almost all Americans, which is why it should be abolished. But wait, you might say, won't abolishing the Electoral College and voting directly for president cause candidates to spend all their time in big cities? That wouldn't be fair to most Americans either. This sounds like a reasonable fear, but ignores the mathematical reality of population distribution. There are 309 million people in the United States, only 8 million of which live in New York, the largest city by far. That's 2.6% of the total population. But after New York, the size of cities drops fast. LA has 3.8 million people and Chicago has 2.7. But you can't even make it to the 10th biggest city, San Jose, before you're under a million people. These top 10 cities added together are only 7.9% of the popular vote, hardly enough to win an election. And even winning the next 90 biggest cities in the United States all the way down to Spokane is still not yet 20% of the total population. So unless there's a city with a few 100 million people hiding somewhere in America that's been left out of the census, the idea that a candidate can just spend their campaign jetting between New York, LA, and Chicago while ignoring everyone else and still become president is mathematically ludicrous. Want to see the real way to unfairly win? How you can become president with only 22% of the popular vote by taking advantage of the Electoral College today. Don't believe that's possible in a democracy? Just watch. Here's the action plan. Win the votes of the people who count the most and ignore the people who count the least. Start with Wyoming, the state where 0.18% of Americans live, but who get 0.56% of the Electoral College votes for president. And because it's a winner-take-all system, you don't need all of them to vote for you, just half plus one, or 0.09%. Next up is the District of Columbia, where winning 0.1% of the population gets you an additional 0.56% of the Electoral College. Then add in wins in Vermont and North Dakota and Alaska. Notice how the votes you're getting to win the presidency go up much faster than the percent of the population who voted for you because of the Electoral College's rules. Next is South Dakota, then Delaware, Montana, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, Hawaii, Idaho, Nebraska, West Virginia, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Kansas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Iowa, Connecticut, Oklahoma, Oregon, Kentucky, Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama, Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, Arizona, Indiana, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New Jersey. Congratulations! By taking advantage of the unfair rules and winning states, not people, you've won a majority in the Electoral College even though 78% of the population voted against you. This is not democracy, this is indefensible. While this particular scenario is unlikely, if you have a voting system that allows losers to win, you shouldn't be surprised when they do. Not once, not twice, but thrice in American history, the candidate with the most votes from the people actually lost because of the Electoral College. 3 errors in 55-plus elections is a failure rate of 5%. Would anyone tolerate a sport where, by a quirk of the rules, there was a 5% chance that the loser would win? Not likely. Given how much more important electing the President of the United States is, that's a rather dangerously high percentage of the time to get it wrong. If we abolish the Electoral College and simply let citizens vote for the President directly, all of these problems will go away and everyone's vote will be equal.
Okay. So now we're going to look at gerrymandering or magic with geography. If you're someone who wants to make a lot of money looking at statistics and the location of people, this is a future area for you. But gerrymandering is a really hot topic right now because it's coming before the Supreme Court based on how it's done in a lot of locations. Gerrymandering impacts federal elections, but then it also impacts local elections. In Houston, our school board has different districts for representation. You also have your state legislatures, which are impacted by gerrymandering. And so this is the intentional redistricting to be in favor usually of one party or another. The video you're going to watch, it's about 10 and a half minutes long, and it's really recent. It just came out. And it has to do with the elections that just occurred, but then also a lot to do with the Supreme Court. Know this, though, gerrymandering happens with both parties. The Republicans have arguably been better at it, meaning that they've been better at redrawing a lot of the local legislatures so that they have more Republican representation in Congress. However, Democrats have been known to redistrict areas too. So the Morocco video is really good, and it's about 10 minutes long. If you watch it and you're still like, I'm not really sure about this, there's another video link that I included in the PowerPoint, and it explains it really simplistically. And it's the video that I've used in the past, but the one that just came out is really good.
Federal judges this past week ordered a redrawing of the lines between congressional districts in North Carolina, while the Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal of a similar ruling in Texas. And then there's Pennsylvania, which features a congressional map that some critics say looks like a cartoon. Our cover story is reported by Mo Rocca.
Goofy's over there, and he's kicking Donald.
No, what? I thought that Goofy was here doing the kicking. You think this is Goofy kicking Donald?
I don't know.
This is not a Rorschach test, and these are not patients.
Oh, those are his ears flapping.
Oh, the ears are flapping. Oh, okay, I got it.
They're suburban Philadelphia voters who live next door to Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District, nicknamed Goofy Kicking Donald for its absurd, well, you can see why.
Wait a minute. Just, would Goofy ever kick Donald?
Not
I don't think Goofy...
Not and stay in the Disney World.
This district is one of the most gerrymandered in America.
What we're looking at is a disgrace, a political disgrace. There's no reason for that kind of gerrymandering. Here it is, folks, right in front of you.
And welcome to Gerrymandering 101. I promise you this won't hurt much. Gerrymandering is the manipulation of voting district lines, usually to give one party an advantage over the other. The word comes from Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who in 1812 signed off on this salamander-shaped district, hence the term gerrymander, which sounds a lot better than gerrymander. Okay, there are 435 members in the House of Representatives. Pennsylvania has a lot of people, so it gets 18 House seats, like so. Now, some of these shapes, not just the 7th, are pretty wacky. We can all agree on that. Now, I know you're asking, why not just lay a nice rectangular grid over Pennsylvania? Problem solved, right? Well, you can't do that because people don't live evenly spread out. You got a lot of people over in Philly, a bunch over in Pittsburgh, not a lot of people in those places with no dots. Personally, I'd live over in Hershey. And each district has to have the same number of people. For that reason, and others we'll get to later, the shapes of districts are almost never going to be perfect squares. But how these shapes got to be so wacky is the issue here. Pennsylvania Democrats say the Republican-controlled state house drew these lines, or gerrymandered them, to create as many safe Republican seats as possible. Last election, Republicans won little more than half of the statewide vote, but the lion's share of congressional seats, 13 out of 18. Thank you for listening, and now let's return to our angry voters.
We're not getting the representation that we were intended to get, and the politicians just jiggle it around to meet their needs, not our needs.
They're angry because they say their Democratic-leaning communities were deliberately kept out of the 7th and lumped into the heavily Republican 16th district, ensuring that both went red.
It causes people, I think, to wonder, why should they even go out to vote? Is my vote going to count?
It was done to us personally And there is no rational justification for that other than blind, naked power.
But I do think it's very difficult for us to try to draw these lines.
Both parties are guilty of gerrymandering.
Notorious examples of gerrymandering.
And both parties have long decried it.
The fact is, gerrymandering has become a national scandal.
It is absolutely essential that we block the gerrymandering ways of the Democratic Party.
But increasingly, the discussion around gerrymandering has been about the threat it poses to American democracy itself. Few current representatives want to talk about it. Iowa's Rod Blum does.
We shouldn't have to rig the system in our favor, or the Democrats shouldn't have to rig the system in their favor.
Blum is a Tea Party Republican who represents Iowa's 1st, a Democratic-leaning district. Blum says he can't afford to ignore any of his constituents.
With gerrymandering, the politician knows that they can be extreme right or extreme left and get reelected. If the district was more like mine, split evenly, then you're looking at every bill. What's a Republican think of this? What's a Democrat think of this? What's an independent think of it?
His is not a typical district. Nationwide gerrymandering is one reason that the number of competitive congressional seats, those where both parties have a good shot of winning, has plunged over the past 20 years from 164 to just 72. Now keep an eye on Pennsylvania's 7th. Those district lines we've been talking about are redrawn every 10 years, right after the census, usually by the state legislature, in a process known as redistricting. Get a load of how the 7th has changed over the years. Few know this process better than Kim Brace. For more than 40 years, he's been hired, mostly by Democrats, to help draw congressional districts. He was the only map maker we identified that was willing to talk to us on camera. You've got a lot of power in your pen.
That's true. It's not your pen. It's now a mouse.
It's a mouse.
It's a mouse.
And armed with mountains of voter data, it's become more science than art. Theoretically, you could say to a Republican incumbent, listen, the 5300 block of River Road is a lot more Democratic now. Let's cut that out.
Sure.
When we draw the map.
Sure, that's possible. That's possible.
But Brace says there are a lot of factors that have to be considered. For instance, districts have to be contiguous. Communities of interest should be kept together. And how about this one?
Incumbent requests and incumbent protection is something that the courts have recognized is a fact of redistricting life.
Incumbent protection, like they're spotted owls.
Or something along that line, yes.
But this was precisely the rationale back in 2001 when, to protect the seat of Illinois Democrat Bobby Rush, Kim Brace cut out this residential block, home to a young primary challenger named Barack Obama.
You gerrymandered the future president of the United States out of a congressional district.
Right. So he then went for U.S. Senate and used that elevation to then become president.
Right. Not even a president could do what you did.
Probably not, I guess.
The general perception, it seems, not just from Democrats, from a lot of Republicans who want limits on gerrymandering, is that gerrymandering is bad for democracy.
It's not always the case, but one person's gerrymander is another one's beautiful art creation.
There may be no better example of this than Brace's most famous or infamous creation, Illinois' 4th, better known as the earmuffs. It was drawn to comply with the Voting Rights Act, which mandates that racial minorities be able to elect one of their own. And so he connected 2 Latino neighborhoods on Chicago's west side by this narrow highway corridor.
So we're in the 4th right now.
That's correct.
But you say there, over here, I'm in the Illinois 7th. And now I'm in the Illinois 4th. Now I'm in the Illinois 5th. So 3 different districts right there.
That's correct, right there.
That's pretty amazing.
That is amazing.
Back in the 1990s, it was racial gerrymandering like this that dominated the discussion. Then in 2010, the GOP launched an ambitious campaign to win control of state governments and redraw the lines in their favor. They succeeded in a big way.
It was a sea change. We've now seen Congress being in control by the Republicans for this entire decade.
While Republican House candidates won about half of the nationwide vote in 2016, they took 55% of the seats, 241 to the Democrats' 194. But, and this is important, even if lines were not being drawn to favor Republicans, Democrats would still be at something of a disadvantage, says Stanford political scientist Jonathan Roden. That's because of where they live.
Democrats have been clustered in cities in the industrialized states ever since the New Deal. Ever since FDR, cities have become more Democratic and rural areas more Republican.
Roden studies how increasingly Republicans are spread across rural areas and Democrats packed into urban areas. Consider the influence on a state like Missouri.
The Democrats are highly concentrated in St. Louis and Kansas City. The gubernatorial elections are always very close. It's a place that Democrats can win statewide. But the best they can hope for in an 8-seat congressional delegation is 3 seats, and the current outcome is 2.
So is the issue gerrymandering or geography?
It's geography and gerrymandering. In order to understand the outcomes we see, we have to understand how those 2 things interact.
Hey, ho, ho, gerrymandering has to go.
But it's gerrymandering that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. A ruling is expected this spring. And Iowa's Rod Blum is willing to risk any advantage gerrymandering currently gives his party. If putting curbs on partisan gerrymandering meant ceding control of the House to the Democrats, how would you feel about that?
I'm okay with it. We need to recruit good candidates, and we need to get out there, and we need to do a good job of governing, and we need to sell our message to the voters.
Losing an election is no small thing.
And I think the opposite. I think, if you lose an election, it's okay. That's the way our government is set up, not to have these people be here 30, 40, 50 years.
As for our voters in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court is considering redrawing the map. For them, a decision can't come soon enough.
Everyone wants to be treated fairly. Gerrymandering isn't fair. It's cheating. It's taking our votes and putting them where they won't make a difference.
Okay, so that's a look at federal and state level government, and sometimes gerrymandering will influence local elections. But when you think about it, I would focus on it at the federal and the state level. Keep in mind scale. So think back to the pyramid that's at the beginning of the lesson. And there's lots of layers of government in the U.S. We have federal, we have state, we have what's called county or municipal government. And in Louisiana, it's known as a parish. So Louisiana is the exception, and it has parishes, not counties. And then you'll have cities. Sometimes you'll have a township government, and sometimes government will even go as low as a homeowners association. And homeowners associations, or HOAs, are groups of people who decide what can or can't be done in a neighborhood. Once you get below the state level, it gets a little hazy because there's lots of different ways that it's done in states. And then also there may be so many different forms of local government. Sometimes it just goes as low as county, depending on how populated the area is. But the main point is that there's local services that help people locally. Right now, with all the ICE and the school closures, that's something that's happening on the city level, and that the transportation services in the court system was closed at the city level. But at the state level, it wasn't closed. It's bad enough and widespread enough that they've closed things on the county level. But again, Texas isn't closed. The federal government isn't closed. And you have to realize that there's also different levels of services that are provided by the different levels of government. So keep in mind changing scale. We're going to watch one of the most magical videos ever, and it's only 4 minutes long. There's no other lecture stuff that's out after it. What you need to know is that it's Canadian, and you shouldn't talk to people in trench coats on the street, especially here in Texas. There's no reason for a person to be wearing a trench coat, and if they are, that's really creepy. But it's Canadian, and it does a great job of kind of breaking down different governments and how they have responsibilities in different areas. So if you have a complaint to lodge, or if you have something that you want to follow through with, you need to figure out which section of the government is responsible for that aspect. If I want to appeal property taxes, I actually go to Harris County because my property taxes are done through Harris County. If I'm concerned about what's going on in the schools, then I'd go to the city school board. So there's all these different layers. And after that, the lecture's done. Go to the hub, take the quiz.
Diddly doo, twiddly diddly dee, doodly 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 doo. Garbage! Look at this garbage! I'm so angry, I'm going to write a letter to the federal government.
Oh, I wouldn't do that. Garbage is not a federal responsibility.
Well, in that case, I'm going to write a letter to the provincial government.
Actually, garbage is not a provincial responsibility either. It's a municipal responsibility. Canada has 3 main levels of government, and they are each responsible for different areas.
All these different levels of government. It's so confusing. I just want to know, who does what?
Who does what?
I really want to know.
Who does what? That's what I'm gonna show ya. I'm not just talking to you, but in fact to all ya. Gonna explain about the federal government in Ottawa. Important, they're in charge of our national security. This includes defense and the military. Canada's often dealing with other nations, so they are in charge of international relations. You say you wanna become a Canadian? Then go talk to citizenship and immigration. They're also in charge of the money and the banking, and next time you write a letter, it's them you should be thanking, for they also take care of the postal service. You wanna learn more? I've only scratched the surface. My curious friend, keep on listening up. Gonna tell you more about who does what. Now the provinces, they are a different situation. Got their own responsibilities as a part of this nation. Because this country is so big and tall, it's too much for the federal government to take care of it all. So they split some things up and give it to Ontario. Schools and education are provincial, don't you know? Dig a little deeper and you will see that healthcare is also a provincial responsibility. And there's social assistance and natural resources, you know, energy, wildlife, and of course all the fishes. Well, we're at it. Say you want to drive a car, you'll need a license from the province or you won't get far. You want to know more? Well, you're in luck, because I'm gonna keep talking about who does what. Who does what?
I really want to know.
Who does what? That's what I'm gonna show ya. Alright, moving along, getting to the nitty-gritty. Municipal covers the towns and the cities, so municipal deals with things that are local, like your library or even snow removal. There's also public transit to get you place to place. Listen up, kid, I'm gonna pick up the pace. You wanna build a new house so you can live it to the max. You'll need a building permit, you'll pay property tax, you'll need water. What about the garbage you produce? These things all live under municipal's roof. You got me going, so I won't give up. Still got more to say about who does what. Now, some more responsibilities that we shouldn't forget, which are shared between 3 levels of government. Let's take transportation. I bet you didn't know that there are federal, provincial, and municipal roads. There's also federal, provincial, and municipal laws, and 3 levels of police to enforce them all. Environment, parks, tourism, there's another 3. And there are many more examples that you can see, but I can't talk forever, so I'm summing it all up. You should have a better idea about who does what. Who does what?
I really want to know.
Who does what? That's what I'm gonna show ya. Who does what?
Now I think I know.
Who does what? That is what I showed ya. Who does what?
Who does what?
Who does what? That is what I showed ya.
Who does what?